Recently, a video of Voddie Baucham went viral on X, where he was asked if there's a biblical reason why Christians shouldn't be cremated. The post generated hundreds of replies, most of them negative.
Wrong, so wrong.
Arguing that it was a bad take and there's nothing wrong with cremation. In this video, I'm going to show you the clip, highlight some of the backlash, and then give you a more thorough answer as to why Christians should not choose cremation as a general rule.
If we really return to dust, is there any biblical reasoning against cremation? Yes, there is biblical reasoning against cremation. Number one, because we have the example of burial throughout the Bible. Number two, because cremation is a pagan practice and has always been a pagan practice. And the pagans cremate because they do not respect the body. They believe that what's really important is the spirit, and that the body is kind of this cage in which the spirit finds itself. So Christianity has always been about the respect of the body because we're made in the image of God. Only paganism has promoted cremation, and Christians are buried. You know, the idea of the resurrection of the body uses language of, you know, being raised from the ground. The idea of baptism. Baptism is about being buried and then being raised again, you know, from the ground. So yes, our respect from the body is based on a biblical ethic, and cremation is based on a pagan ethic that does not respect the human body.
Here are some of the replies to Voddie's video. Rare L from Mr. Baucham. I disagree. After I leave my body, I could care less what happens to it. Slow decay in the ground or a quick decay, no difference. What are the odds that the Baucham family enjoys a good Christmas tree? That too is pagan. I love Voddie, but this is silly in my opinion. And he quotes absolutely no scripture in making and or supporting his point, specifically about cremation. None. Sad this little video is passed off as sound doctrine. I simply disagree because I think the flesh only has value because of the spirit in us. When that spirit goes to heaven, there is no use for the body. Now, to be fair, Voddie had just over a minute and was speaking off the cuff. What he didn't have time to provide, I'll now lay out in full. A biblical and historical case for why burial should be preferred under normal circumstances. Burial is to be preferred because Christians believe in the resurrection of the body, not just the soul. This hope leads us to treat the body with respect in death, and to visually symbolize our confidence that God is not finished with the physical body. There are four main reasons why burial is to be the preferred Christian practice. The first is that burial is normative in scripture. The second is cremation in the Bible is associated with judgment. The third is that burial was universally practiced in the church until very recently. And then the fourth is that burial better symbolizes the Christian's beliefs and hope. In scripture, burial was the norm. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, David, and Jesus were all buried. Even Moses, who died alone on a mountain, was buried by God himself. Joseph, before his death, made Israel promise to carry his bones to the promised land, a clear act of faith in physical resurrection and the covenant promises of God. Throughout both covenants, you see burial as the exclusive practice of all the faithful. Cremation, on the other hand, appears only in the Bible in context of judgment, curse, or disgrace. It is said of Achan, who stole devoted things from Jericho, that they burned them with fire and stoned them with stones. Nadab and Abihu offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, and the scriptures say, "And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord." In Amos 2:1, God condemned Moab for burning the bones of Edom's king. God said, "I will not revoke the punishment because he burned to lime the bones of the king of Edom." This shows that the act was a grievous sin worthy of judgment. Additionally, in the New Testament, burial is tied directly to the meaning of baptism. Romans says, "We were buried therefore with him by baptism into death." Therefore, we're incentivized to preserve the symbolism of burial as a normative Christian practice because its imagery is central to baptism. In summary, burial in Scripture is the normative practice associated with honor, covenant faithfulness, and resurrection hope, while the burning of bodies is tied to God's judgment, covenant breaking, and disgrace. Burial remained the uncontested norm in church history until the late 1800s, when liberal Protestants in England and America began advocating for cremation. Even today, the Eastern Orthodox Church totally forbids cremation. The Roman Catholic Church forbade it until 1963, but even now in their 1983 canon law still strongly prefers burial. But the strongest witness comes from the early church. Tertullian said, "The practice of Christians is to bury the dead. Among the heathens, bodies are burned. Among us, they are buried." Cyril of Jerusalem said, "Let us not be like the heathen who burn their dead." At the Council of Braga in 563, they said, "If anyone denies the resurrection of the body and chooses to burn the bodies of the dead rather than bury them, let him be anathematized." The burning of Christian martyrs was intended to shake the confidence of believers in the resurrection, but it never deprived them of that hope. In fact, with Polycarp, who was burned at the stake in 155 AD, Christians still gathered his remains and gave him a proper burial. This shows how deeply committed the early church was to the practice of burial. Another strong witness to the early church's commitment was the Roman catacombs. These underground tunnels beneath the streets of Rome stretch for hundreds of kilometers and contain the remains of hundreds of thousands of Christians. The catacombs were almost exclusively used by Christians, clearly reflecting their belief in the bodily resurrection and the rejection of cremation. After Christianity became the dominant faith in the Roman Empire under Constantine, cremation decreased and disappeared entirely by the 5th century. Further evidence that burial was the norm among the faithful. Another thing you're likely aware of is the custom of church graveyards, which emerged in the 6th and 7th centuries. This practice didn't begin to decline until the 19th century, but is still upheld today by traditionalist churches like Anglicans, Lutherans, and Catholics. It's a beautiful picture of our hope, where the faithful of a congregation are buried together in anticipation of all being raised together at the end of history. Now, anyone familiar with church history knows that Christianity has been a persecuted religion for most of its existence, and many of our forefathers were burned alive, not by choice. But this discussion is about what we should prefer under normal circumstances. There are valid exceptions, such as when someone dies on a long voyage at sea. Before refrigeration, bodies would begin to decompose quickly, and burial at sea was the only practical option. In extremely high-density population centers like Tokyo or Hong Kong, traditional burial plots are extremely expensive, often costing between $30,000 to $50,000 US. But then they're also only temporary. They're leases that usually only last for 6 to 10 years with no option to renew. That means even if you could afford that much for a burial, the body would still be exhumed and cremated after the lease expires. Now, while these are valid exceptions, we do not create new norms based on them. We can still say that under normal circumstances, whenever it's in our power, burial is to be preferred as the best option. These two responses to Voddie's video really emphasize for me the importance of burial and shows what can be lost when we act like all options are equally valid. I simply disagree because I think the flesh only has value because of the spirit in us. When that spirit goes to heaven, there is no use for the body. That is one of his more silly takes. The flesh is evil and worthless after death. When I die, all that is a lump of dying organic matter. These comments are inspired by an ancient heresy called Gnosticism. Gnosticism was anti-material and anti-body, claiming that only the spiritual realm was good and that the goal of life is to escape the physical body. It was rejected by the early church, and that is why we confess in the Apostles' Creed, "I believe in the resurrection of the body," because that is the Christian hope, that our physical bodies will be resurrected and renewed. To believe that God is done with our bodies, that the body is worthless, or as that commentator said, evil, is to espouse Gnosticism. Now, this isn't about whether God can resurrect someone who was cremated. He certainly can. The question is, what should Christians prefer when they have a choice? Burial is not just an old tradition. It is a rich, biblical symbol that honors the body and declares our hope in the resurrection. Scripture shows burial as the consistent pattern of the faithful. Church history across centuries and denominations affirm it as the normative Christian practice. And most importantly, it best reflects our belief that God will raise our physical bodies on the last day. Cremation may be allowed in extreme cases, but it should not become the default. When we treat all options as equal, we risk drifting into Gnostic thinking, denying the goodness of the body and forgetting the central Christian hope. So why burial? Because it proclaims the gospel even in death. If you want a careful, biblically grounded examination of cremation and burial, check out What About Cremation? A Christian Perspective by John J. Davis. Davis walks through scripture and church history to explain why Christians have historically practiced burial and how it reflects our hope in the resurrection of the body. It's a respectful and measured resource that deals with the issue without compromise. Thanks so much for watching. If you found it helpful, would you mind clicking like before you leave? And if you want more content like this in your feed, click subscribe and hit the notification bell. See you in the next video.